They say she never lost a war, that her mind was sharper than any blade, that her silence could command armies, her gaze could end sieges. But they never asked, what happens to a goddess who always wins and never rests? This is God and demon, where even victories to weaves scars. Athena was not born screaming. She emerged, fully formed, armored, ready, from the head of Zeus, not cradled, not wept over, not welcomed with warmth, but forged, in thought, in calculation, in need. And so she believed that feeling was weakness, that to rule the battlefield, she must first destroy the battlefield within. So she silenced the tremble in her hand, the ache in her voice, the pull in her chest when mortals cried not for justice, but for someone to listen. She didn't listen. She strategized. She did not comfort. She corrected, because she thought wisdom meant distance. That love blurred clarity. That feeling invited ruin. And so she became what Olympus needed. Perfect, untouchable, victorious. They carved her name into shields, painted her likeness on temple walls, but not because they loved her, because they feared what happened when she was ignored, because wisdom ignored is vengeance disguised as order. Athena never lost a war, but what did she win? A throne in marble halls, a name whispered in war camps, a presence summoned only when blood was close. No one called her when children were born. No one sang to her before sleep. They came to her when they were ready to destroy, and she always answered, but in the quiet, after the battle, after the silence. She sat alone, not because she was feared, but because no one knew how to hold her. No one asked if she was tired, if she remembered what it felt like, to not be right, to not be needed. She watched Aphrodite dance in beauty, watched Hestia warm homes, watched mortals fall apart over love they barely understood. And she mocked them, because mocking was easier than wanting, because wanting meant admitting she lacked something, and Athena could lack nothing. That was the rule, that was the image, that was the lie, because even gods can lie to themselves. And in the deepest part of her temple, where no worshipper entered, she kept a shield, not for battle, but to look into, not to admire her face, but to remind herself who she was supposed to be, to practice not shaking, to rehearse the answers they expected, to remember that her pain was not part of the myth, and myths do not bleed, even when they break. She gave counsel to kings, told them how to conquer, how to rule, how to silence the chaos. But she never told them that she too heard voices in the dark, voices that whispered, "Was it ever your choice? Did you choose the armor, or did they dress you in it before you could ask?" And when the voices grew loud, she drowned them in strategy, in maps, in speeches laced with certainty. But certainty is not peace. It is just the loudest lie in the room. And Athena, she was the best liar Olympus had ever seen, because she believed her own myths. Until one day, she didn't. Until one day, she met someone who didn't ask for her wisdom, didn't seek her power. Someone who just asked, "Do you ever rest?" And she couldn't answer, not because she didn't want to, but because she had never been asked. That night, she didn't dream of battle. She dreamed of silence, but not the silence after war, not the silence of death, the silence of being known, without needing to win, without needing to be right, without needing to be divine. But morning came, and with it, the armor, the voice, the lie. She stood again, flawless, victorious, alone. They called her the goddess of wisdom, but no one asked what it cost her. They marveled at her calm, but never wondered what she silenced to maintain it. Athena did not rage. She didn't need to. Rage was fire. She was stone, unmoved, unbroken, but even stone remembers pressure. Even statues crack from within. She sat in councils with gods who made decisions through impulse, Zeus with his thunder, Ares with his bloodlust, Poseidon with his pride, and Athena with her silence. She was the weapon that never shattered, but only because she was never thrown. Not truly, because even the gods feared what would happen if she missed. They trusted her to be logic incarnate, a force that never questioned, only calculated. But wisdom is not the absence of feeling. It is the burden of knowing what feeling leads to. She knew what mercy looked like and what it cost. She had seen men fall to their knees in front of her, not to love her, but to beg for clarity, to beg for the right thing to do, as if her voice was fate, as if she wasn't still wondering what the right thing was for herself. She told Odysseus how to survive, but never told him how to live. She led Perseus to glory, but never asked what it meant to kill something that once looked human. She stood by mortals, always behind them, always guiding, but never holding, because she didn't know how. No one ever held her. She had no mother's touch, no father's tenderness. She was born from thought, and thoughts don't embrace you. They direct you, they demand of you, they define you. So she defined herself in service, in discipline, in being needed. And when the wars ended, when the heroes returned home, when the altars cooled, she remained, still standing, still prepared. For a battle no one asked her to fight, a war within herself that had no enemy, no map, no end. She walked among mortals at night, not as goddess, but as shadow. She listened to their dreams, not their prayers. She watched them cry into their hands, then pick themselves up without help, and something in her broke, not loudly, but like a quiet realization that they were stronger than she allowed herself to be, because they dared to feel, to fall apart, to be held. And she, for all her brilliance, had built herself to be unreachable, not because she didn't want closeness, but because she feared what would happen if someone reached out and she didn't know how to reach back. She remembered Medusa, not as a curse, but as a mirror of what happens when pain is turned into silence, when rage is buried beneath the stone of what's expected. And Athena, the ever-wise, understood, but too late to undo the myth, too late to unmake the image, too late to say sorry. So she stayed silent, because gods don't apologize. They rewrite history, and Athena, she rewrote herself every day until she couldn't tell if the woman in the shield was her or just the version the world demanded she become. They called her divine, unshakable, but divinity is the loneliest disguise. Because when you are always right, no one dares to ask if you're okay. Athena stood in marble, in gold, in praise carved deep into temple walls, but no temple was ever built for her sorrow, no songs were ever sung for her ache. And still, she stood, because gods don't crumble, they calcify. She watched as mortals aged, failed, loved, wept, and yet they lived fuller than she ever did, because they were allowed to make mistakes, to break and be forgiven. She could not afford to break. There was no mythology for a weeping goddess of war. So she smiled in stillness, offered strategy, wore reason like armor, and buried every fragile thing inside her. But buried things don't die. They root, and roots crack stone. She remembered the first time a mortal looked at her, not in awe, but with kindness. No pleading, no fear, just eyes that asked nothing and offered everything. It terrified her, because she had no defense for gentleness, no blueprint for vulnerability. She had built temples out of control, and here was someone who touched her name, like it wasn't sacred, but human. She left that night, not out of anger, but confusion, because the war she feared most was the one without enemies, the one that happened in the quiet, when no one needed her power, only her presence. She began to dream, not of battle, but of herself, alone, in the cave of her beginning, in the thought from which she was born. And in the dream, she wept, and the cave did not echo. It held her. For the first time, she was not a goddess. She was a woman who never had a childhood, never had a choice, only a purpose, a role, an expectation carved in thunder. She woke up, and the tears were still there, but no one saw them. Because gods don't cry, unless it's in the stories no one tells. She returned to Olympus, to the marble, the light, the throne, and it all felt hollow. She knew it would, because once you feel what it means to be seen, everything else feels like performance, and she was tired of performing, but tiredness was a human thing, so she swallowed it. Like all the other things, she took up the spear. She raised her voice. She advised. She fought. She won. And somewhere deep inside, she lost something else. Something she could never name, because wisdom could describe everything, except itself. They say Athena never lost, that her mind was unbreakable, that her name stood for reason, for justice, for victory, but none of those things ever held her at night. None of those things ever whispered back when she was alone. They carved her into myth, into marble, into perfection, and in doing so, they erased her. They made her a symbol, and symbols do not bleed, symbols do not doubt, symbols do not long. But Athena did, quietly, in places no prayer ever reached. She began to walk the earth again, not as goddess, but as shadow, as thought. She watched mothers hush crying infants and envied the softness of lullabies. She watched lovers touch foreheads in silence and wondered if her own ever felt warm. She stood beside a dying soldier, and he looked at her, not with fear, but with peace, because to him, she was not judgment, she was company, and in that moment, she felt human, and it terrified her, because gods are not meant to feel, they are meant to endure, to instruct, to persist, but endurance without feeling is not strength, it is stone, and even stone erodes. She went back to the cave, the dream, the silence from which she emerged, and asked it one question: who was I before they named me? And the cave, for once, did not answer, because it did not know, because she had never been allowed to be anything else. She touched her own reflection, and it blinked, but not in obedience, in grief, because the woman staring back was not a goddess, not a warrior, not a strategist, just a soul, waiting to be chosen, not for what she could do, but for who she was. She never lost a war, but maybe she never won one either, because she was never fighting others. She was fighting silence, expectation, myth, and myth always wins. This is God and demon, where even the most perfect minds can fracture in quiet places. If this story showed you a side of strength that no one speaks of, like, share, and subscribe, because not all battles are loud, and not all gods want to be gods forever. Based on Greek mythology, some events have been reimagined for emotional and cinematic storytelling purposes.